On my birthday, my son gave me a special gift, a brochure for a nursing home. His cold smile promised more than just a joke. Dad, this is for your future. I was silent, but my anger was boiling in my soul. This betrayal from the man I raised fueled the fire of revenge. I smiled only at his wedding when I thanked him for real. There was no stopping me. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. My fingers stopped moving the moment I saw it. The tissue paper fell away like autumn leaves, and there it was, a glossy brochure with smiling elderly faces and cheerful yellow lettering. Sunset Manor, your new chapter, begins here. The monthly rates were circled in red pen, bold numbers that made my stomach drop. Happy birthday, Dad. Chris stood in my living room doorway, his smile sharp as winter ice. It's time you moved somewhere more suitable. I held the brochure with both hands, feeling its weight like lead. The coffee table beneath it seemed miles away. Around us, my house, the house Susan and I bought 37 years ago, suddenly felt foreign. Chris, what is this? He walked to the mantel, picking up a framed photo of his college graduation. I'm getting married next month, Dad. Meredith and I need the house to start our family. His voice carried that matter-of-fact tone he used when selling cars at the dealership. You're 62. This is practical. The birthday cake sat untouched on the kitchen counter. 62 candles melted into colorful puddles. I'd blown them out an hour ago, making a wish for my son's happiness. The irony tasted bitter now. You and Meredith can live here with me for the first year, I said, setting the brochure down carefully. There's plenty of room. Chris laughed, but it wasn't the sound I remembered from his childhood. This laugh had edges. Dad, that won't work. We need our privacy, our space. He moved toward the stairs, then stopped. Look, I've been thinking about this for months. If you won't give me the house willingly, I'll take it anyway. Take it? You put my name on the deed, remember? After Mom died, you said it was so I'd always have a home. He started climbing the stairs, each footstep deliberate. Well, now I need that home. I followed him to the bottom of the staircase, watching as he disappeared around the corner. Drawers began opening and closing above me. The sound of hangers scraping against metal rods filled the quiet house. Chris, this is still my home. No response, just the thud of items being thrown into bags, the creak of floorboards under hurried feet. I returned to the living room, picked up the nursing home brochure again. The elderly people in the photos looked content, but their smiles seemed painted on. 20 minutes later, Chris reappeared with an empty suitcase, heading for the front door. He paused, looking back at me with those blue eyes, Susan's eyes that I'd once found so much comfort in. I'll be staying at the Hampton Inn until the wedding, he said. You have a month to think about this, Dad, but my mind's made up. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving me alone with the brochure and the sound of his footsteps on the porch stairs. Through the window, I watched him load the suitcase into his Honda Civic, the same car I'd helped him buy 3 years ago. The engine started with a familiar rumble, and then he was gone, leaving only tire tracks in my driveway and the echo of his ultimatum hanging in the air. The ceiling creaked above me like old bones settling. Drawer after drawer slammed shut, followed by the scrape of hangers being swept across metal rods. I sat in my recliner, the nursing home brochure still in my hands, listening to my son systematically erase himself from my house. A heavy thud shook the chandelier, then another. Chris's footsteps moved across the floor in determined patterns. Closet to dresser, dresser to bed, bed to door. The sounds painted a picture I didn't want to see. My boy packing his life into boxes and bags, preparing to walk away from everything we'd built together. I stood and walked to the base of the stairs, gripping the banister. Chris, can we talk about this? Silence, then the squeak of his bedroom door opening. His footsteps headed toward the bathroom now. The medicine cabinet clicked open and shut. Even his toothbrush was leaving me. The house felt different already, like something vital had been switched off. I wandered into the kitchen, past the untouched birthday cake, and stared out the window at Mrs. Patterson working in her garden next door. She'd known Chris since he was 7, had watched him grow from a boy who needed help reaching the cookie jar to this stranger demanding my home. When Susan died 15 years ago, Chris had been my anchor. 14 years old and trying to be the man of the house, he'd helped me learn to cook, reminded me to pay bills, sat with me during those first terrible months when grief felt like drowning. I'd worked double shifts at the electrical company to pay for his college, to give him everything I never had. The overtime hours, the weekend jobs, the sacrifice, it had all felt worthwhile when I saw him graduate, watched him build his career. Heavy footsteps on the stairs interrupted my memories. Chris appeared in the kitchen doorway, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder, a cardboard box under his arm. His movements were efficient, businesslike. "I'm taking my laptop and the tools you gave me last Christmas," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Those tools belong to your grandfather?" "You gave them to me." He set the box on the counter. "Look, Dad, this doesn't have to be ugly. Just think about what I said. The nursing home has activities. People your age. You'll make friends." My age? As if 62 meant I should be shuffling around in slippers, playing bingo on Tuesday nights. I'd been working since I was 16, owned this house free and clear, had $150,000 in savings from a lifetime of careful decisions. But to my son, I was just an obstacle to his future with Meredith. "I raised you alone for 15 years, I said quietly. "After your mother died, I never even dated. Everything I did was for you." Chris shifted the duffel bag to his other shoulder. "I know, Dad, and I appreciate that, but that doesn't mean you get to control my adult life." Control? I wasn't trying to control anything. I was trying to understand how the boy who used to fall asleep in my lap watching baseball games had become this cold stranger, demanding my house. He made 2 more trips upstairs, coming down each time with more pieces of his life. The baseball trophies from the mantel, the framed photo of him and Susan at his high school graduation, the acoustic guitar I'd bought him for his 16th birthday, even though he'd barely played it. On his final trip, I followed him outside. The Honda sat in the driveway, packed tight as a moving truck. Mrs. Patterson had stopped her gardening to watch, her pruning shears forgotten in her hands. Chris slammed the trunk shut and turned to face me. For a moment, something flickered in his expression. Maybe guilt, maybe regret. But it passed quickly. "I'll call you," he said. "When?" "When you're ready to be reasonable." He climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine. I stood on my porch steps, watching him back out of the driveway where he'd learned to ride his bike, where I'd taught him to change oil, where we'd played catch on summer evenings until the streetlights came on. The Honda disappeared around the corner, taillights fading into the early evening. Mrs. Patterson gave me a sympathetic wave before going back inside. The neighborhood settled into its usual quiet, but the silence felt different now, heavier, more complete. I walked back through my house, noting the empty spaces. Chris's room looked cavernous without his furniture, just carpet impressions where his desk and dresser had stood. The bathroom medicine cabinet gaped open, empty shelves staring back at me. Even the refrigerator seemed hollow. He'd taken the leftover pizza and the energy drinks I'd bought for his visits. In the living room, I sat down in my recliner and picked up an old photo that had fallen behind the coffee table. Chris at age 7, gap-toothed and grinning, sitting on Susan's lap at his first baseball game. Susan's hand rested on his head, her wedding ring catching the camera flash. Both of them looked so happy, so certain that everything would always be this simple. My phone buzzed in my pocket, vibrating against my leg like a trapped insect. I pulled it out and stared at the screen, hoping to see Chris's name, ready to apologize for whatever I'd done wrong. But it wasn't Chris calling. It was someone else entirely. And as the phone continued ringing in my hands, I realized that my quiet evening was about to become much more complicated. The morning air bit at my face as I shuffled down the driveway in my bathrobe and slippers. Mrs. Patterson was already loading her car for work, briefcase in one hand, travel mug in the other. She waved, and I managed a weak smile back. The mailbox creaked open, revealing the usual stack of bills and catalogs, but on top sat something different. A thick cream envelope with my name printed in elegant script. Back inside, I set my coffee mug on the kitchen table and studied the envelope. The return address was embossed gold. Hartwell and Associates, Legal Counsel. My hands trembled slightly as I tore it open, the expensive paper crisp between my fingers. The letterhead was formal, intimidating. Below it, typed in cold legal language, "Dear Mr. Collins, due to unforeseen circumstances, your invitation to the wedding of Christopher Michael Collins and Meredith Ann Stone scheduled for April 15th, 2025, is hereby rescinded. The ceremony and reception will proceed as planned, but your attendance is no longer requested. Sincerely, Hartwell and Associates, on behalf of the Stone family. I read it 3 times before the words sank in. Unforeseen circumstances. As if my refusal to hand over my house was some natural disaster, something beyond anyone's control. I set the letter on the table and stared at it, feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach. My phone rang. Tom's name flashed on the screen. My younger brother, the only family I had left besides Chris. "Gary, buddy, I've been thinking about your boy's wedding. Should I fly in on Friday or Saturday? And didn't you say something about Martha coming as your date?" I cleared my throat. "Tom, there's been a complication." "What kind of complication?" "How do you explain to your brother that your son has legally disinvited you from his own wedding? That the boy he helped raise after Susan died, the kid who called him Uncle Tommy and spent summers at his house in Iowa, had chosen a cold letter from lawyers over a conversation? Chris and I had a disagreement. I won't be attending." "You won't be—" Tom's voice cracked. "Gary, it's your son's wedding. What kind of disagreement could possibly—" "The kind that involves lawyers, apparently." The silence stretched between us. Tom had been there for everything. Susan's funeral, Chris's graduation, the night I'd called him crying because I didn't know how to help my 14-year-old son with algebra. He'd never heard this tone in my voice before. "Jesus, Gary, what happened?" "I'll explain later. I need to make some phone calls." The next call was harder. Martha, Susan's sister, had been excited about the wedding for weeks. She'd even bought a new dress, something blue that she said made her feel elegant. Now I had to tell her she'd bought it for nothing. "Gary, is everything all right? You sound strange." "Martha, I need to cancel our plans for Chris's wedding." "Cancel?" "Honey, the wedding is next month. I've already arranged the time off work." "There won't be a wedding, not for us anyway." I explained as little as possible, watching her enthusiasm crumble through the phone line. By the time I hung up, I felt like I'd ruined her entire spring. The expensive suit still hung in my bedroom closet, tags dangling from the sleeve. I'd bought it at Men's Warehouse, splurged on the wool blend because I wanted to look good for my son's big day. The salesman had assured me it was perfect for weddings, and I'd imagined Chris introducing me to Meredith's family, proud to show off his father. Now the suit looked like a monument to my stupidity. $400 for an outfit I'd never wear, for a role I'd never play. Father of the groom. My phone buzzed with a text from Pete, my old co-worker from the electrical company. "Can't wait to see Chris get married. You must be so proud." How many more of these conversations would I have? How many friends and neighbors would ask about the wedding, forcing me to explain that my own son had decided I wasn't welcome? The humiliation burned in my chest, mixing shame with the anger I hadn't felt since Susan's diagnosis. I walked to the dining room where Chris's wedding gift sat wrapped in silver paper, a set of sterling silver flatware that had cost me $800. The Waterford pattern, something elegant that would last a lifetime, something that would remind them of me every time they hosted dinner parties in my house. The irony was bitter as black coffee. I'd spent weeks choosing that gift, imagining Chris opening it with Meredith, both of them appreciating the quality, the thoughtfulness. Instead, it sat on my table like a tombstone, marking the death of illusions I should have buried years ago. I picked up my phone again, scrolling through my contacts. My finger hovered over different names, Tom, Martha, even Father Mackenzie from St. Mary's, where Chris had been confirmed. But what would I tell them? That I'd raised a son who chose cruelty over conversation? That the boy I'd sacrificed everything for had hired lawyers to keep me away from his wedding? The cursor blinked over Chris's name. I could call him, try to explain, maybe even apologize for whatever I'd done wrong. But as I stared at his contact photo, a picture from last Christmas when he'd seemed happy to be home, I realized something had fundamentally changed. The boy in that photo was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. My thumb moved away from Chris's name and landed on another contact instead. Someone who might actually understand what I was going through. Someone who'd been there through all of this before, in different ways. As the phone began to ring, I felt something shift inside me. Not quite hope, but something harder. more determined. The computer screen glowed in the dim light of my home office, cursor blinking like a heartbeat in the empty email field. Through the doorway, I could see the dining room table, where Chris's wedding gift still sat, wrapped in silver paper, mocking me with its useless perfection. I'd been sitting here for 20 minutes, typing words and deleting them, trying to find the right tone for what needed to be said. My fingers found the keys and started typing. Chris, since I'm not welcome at your wedding, I won't be contributing to the expenses we discussed. The $15,000 I promised for catering and music will remain in my account. Best wishes for your future. Dad. I deleted Dad and typed Gary, then deleted Gary and typed your father. Finally, I left it unsigned. Cold facts didn't need warm signatures. My finger hovered over the send button. $15,000, money I'd saved by working extra jobs last winter, fixing Mrs. Patterson's electrical problems for cash, skipping the vacation to Florida I'd been planning since Susan died. Every dollar represented hours of my life. Sacrifice for a son who discarded me like old furniture. I clicked send. The email disappeared into cyberspace, carrying with it my contribution to Chris's perfect day. I leaned back in my chair and felt something I hadn't experienced in days. Satisfaction. It tasted different from the bitterness that had been coating my tongue since the nursing home brochure. This was cleaner, sharper, like the first bite of winter air. My phone sat silent on the desk. No immediate response, which surprised me. Chris usually replied to texts and emails within minutes, especially when money was involved. I opened my banking app and looked at the wedding fund I'd carefully built over the past year. $15,437. Money that was staying exactly where it was. I closed the laptop and walked to the kitchen where I made myself a sandwich. Turkey and Swiss on the good bread I usually saved for company. Susan always said I was too practical, too careful with money, but she'd also taught me that self-respect couldn't be bought. Some lessons take longer to learn than others. An hour passed, then two. I tried to distract myself with household tasks, loading the dishwasher, sorting mail, organizing the junk drawer that had needed attention for months. But every few minutes I found myself checking my phone, waiting for Chris to call with threats or apologies or explanations. The phone finally rang at 3:30. Tom's name on the screen. Gary, I've been thinking about our conversation this morning. Tom. No, let me say this. I don't know what happened between you and Chris, but I know you. You raised that boy right after Susan died, worked yourself half to death to give him everything. If you're not going to his wedding, he must have done something unforgivable. The words hit me like warm sunshine. Someone understood. Someone saw the situation clearly. He wants my house, Tom. Gave me a nursing home brochure for my birthday and told me to move out so he and his fiancée could start their family. Silence on the other end. Then, Jesus Christ, Gary, that boy's lost his mind. I pulled my financial support for the wedding today. $15,000 I'd promised for catering and music. Good for you. About time you stood up for yourself. But even as Tom's validation warmed me, doubt crept in around the edges. Was I being too harsh? Chris was still my son, still the boy who'd cried in my arms after his first heartbreak, who'd called me every Sunday during college just to talk. Maybe this was Meredith's influence. Maybe he'd come to his senses. The front door opened, and Mrs. Patterson's voice called out, Gary, I brought you some of my famous pot roast. She appeared in the kitchen doorway carrying a covered dish, her face creased with concern. Word traveled fast in neighborhoods like ours. I saw Chris loading up his car yesterday, she said, setting the dish on my counter. And don't tell me it's none of my business. I've known that boy since he was 7 years old. He's getting married next month, needs space to start his life. Mrs. Patterson fixed me with the same look she'd given her own children when they tried to lie about broken lamps or missing cookies. Gary Collins, I've been your neighbor for 23 years. That boy didn't leave to start his life. He left because he wanted something from you, and you said no. The woman was sharper than most people gave her credit for. I found myself telling her everything, the nursing home brochure, the ultimatum, the legal letter canceling my wedding invitation. She listened without interruption, nodding at the appropriate moments, her expression growing harder with each detail. That child needs a lesson in gratitude, she said when I finished. And his fancy fiance? He needs to learn that money doesn't grow on trees. Money. The word reminded me of the bank account Chris didn't know about, the one with my life insurance payout from the electrical company. Another $37,000 untouchable until I decided what to do with it. Chris assumed I was just an aging electrician with a modest savings account. He had no idea how carefully I'd planned, how much I'd actually accumulated over the years. My phone buzzed on the counter. Chris's name flashed on the screen like a warning light. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times. Mrs. Patterson watched me, pot roast forgotten, both of us understanding that this was the moment everything would change. My hand reached for the phone, then stopped. "You don't have to answer that," she said quietly. But I did have to answer it. Not because I owed Chris anything, but because I needed to hear his voice, needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. The phone continued ringing in my palm, vibrating like a trapped animal, and I realized that the next words spoken would determine whether this story ended in reconciliation or war. "Hello, Chris." My voice came out calmer than I felt, steady as winter ice. "Dad, you can't just cancel the money." His words exploded through the phone speaker, sharp enough to cut glass. "I've already signed contracts. The caterer, the musicians, everything's booked." "You canceled my invitation," I said, settling deeper into my kitchen chair. "I canceled my contribution." That's completely different. This isn't some game where you get to punish me." The desperation in his voice surprised me. In all my years of giving Chris what he wanted, I'd never heard him sound quite so fragile, like something he'd counted on had suddenly vanished. "You gave me a nursing home brochure for my birthday and told me to move out of my own house. How is that different?" Silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of words neither of us could take back. When Chris spoke again, his tone had shifted, become pleading. "Look, Dad, we can work this out. Maybe we can find a way for you to stay in the house longer. Work out some kind of timeline that makes sense for everyone." "Everyone? Not both of us. Everyone." Meaning him and Meredith. "I'm coming over," he said when I didn't respond. "We need to talk about this face to face." The line went dead. I set the phone on the kitchen table and looked around my house, wondering what Chris would try next. Through the window I could see Mrs. Patterson bringing in her mail, moving with the careful steps of someone who'd learned not to hurry through life. Maybe that was wisdom I should have gained years ago. 28 minutes later, Chris's Honda pulled into my driveway with enough speed to scatter gravel. The car door slammed, followed by determined footsteps on my porch. He didn't knock, just used his key and walked in like he still lived here. "Dad?" His voice echoed from the entryway. "Kitchen," I called back. He appeared in the doorway, hair disheveled, shirt wrinkled like he'd dressed in a hurry. His face held that red flush I remembered from his teenage years when he'd been caught breaking curfew or lying about homework. "Okay," he said, pulling out the chair across from me and sitting down uninvited. "Let's figure this out." But instead of sitting still, he immediately stood again, pacing between the table and the refrigerator, like a caged animal. His hands moved constantly, rubbing his face, running through his hair, gesturing at invisible obstacles. "You don't understand the position you've put me in," he said, voice rising. "Meredith's parents are expecting a certain kind of wedding. Her father owns 3 medical equipment stores, Dad. These people have standards." "And what about my standards?" Chris stopped pacing, stared at me. "What's that supposed to mean?" "I have standards too, Chris. One of them is not being treated like garbage by my own son." His face twisted into an expression I didn't recognize, something between anger and panic. "I never treated you like garbage. I brought you a practical solution to a real problem. A nursing home brochure for my birthday. Because you're 62 and living alone in a house that's too big for you." His voice cracked slightly. "Mom would be horrified if she knew you were ruining my wedding over your stubborn pride." The mention of Susan hit like a physical blow, but instead of weakening me, it sparked something harder, cleaner. "Your mother would be horrified by how you're treating me." Chris's mouth opened, then closed. He'd been expecting me to crumble at the mention of Susan, the way I had so many times before when he needed something and pulled her memory into the conversation. "She would want me to be happy," he said, but the words sounded hollow now. "She would want you to be a good man." There's a difference. I stayed seated while he paced, keeping my hands folded on the table, speaking quietly while he grew louder. It was a technique I'd learned in my electrical work. Sometimes the calmest person in the room had the most power. Fine, he said, stopping his pacing to face me directly. You want to play hardball? I can play hardball too. His voice dropped to a whisper that somehow felt more threatening than shouting. Don't expect any relationship with your future grandchildren. The words hung in the air between us like smoke from a house fire. He'd meant them to devastate me, to bring me to my knees begging for forgiveness. Instead, they clarified something I'd been struggling to understand. So that's your plan? I asked. Threaten to take away grandchildren I don't even have yet unless I give you my house? Chris's confidence wavered. He'd overplayed his hand, and we both knew it. Meredith says a lot of things, doesn't she? I interrupted. Meredith says I should move to a nursing home. Meredith says you need my house. Meredith says I'm too old to make my own decisions. What do you say, Chris? He opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time since he'd arrived, he had no ready answer. I say I want what's best for my family. Which family? The one you're starting with Meredith, or the one you're throwing away to get her approval? That hit home. Chris's face went pale, then flushed red again. You're being impossible. I'm being clear. You want my house? Buy it from me at market value. You want my money for your wedding? Invite me like a normal son would invite his father. You want grandchildren in your life? Learn how to treat the grandfather they'd have. Chris stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something shift in his expression, a recognition that I wasn't the same man who'd been raising him for the past 15 years. The man who'd given in to every demand, who'd worked extra shifts to buy him whatever he wanted, who'd sacrificed his own needs for his son's happiness. You've changed, he said, and it didn't sound like a compliment. Yes, I agreed. I have. He walked to my front door without another word, pausing only to look back once. This isn't over, Dad. No, I said quietly. It isn't. The door slammed hard enough to rattle the windows. I heard his car start with an angry roar, tires squealing as he backed out of my driveway. Through the kitchen window, I watched him disappear down the street, probably heading back to the Hampton Inn where he'd been staying since our birthday confrontation. Mrs. Patterson stood in her garden with a watering can, clearly having heard the shouting. She caught my eye through the window and gave me a small wave, not pitying, but supportive, like she understood that sometimes standing your ground meant making noise. I walked to my front window and looked out at the street where Chris's car had been. The evening light painted everything golden, making the neighborhood look peaceful despite the storm that had just blown through my house. For the first time since this whole mess started, I felt something I hadn't expected. Satisfaction. Not happiness. This wasn't a happy situation. But satisfaction that I'd finally said what needed saying, that I'd stopped allowing myself to be manipulated by threats and guilt trips. Chris could take his ultimatums and his conditional love and his future grandchildren and figure out how to build a life without using me as his foundation. I had my own life to live. The evening shadows had deepened while I stood at the window, and Mrs. Patterson had gone inside, her porch light clicking on automatically. I moved away from the glass and found myself walking toward the stairs, drawn by some impulse I couldn't name. My feet carried me to Chris's old bedroom, where I stood in the doorway looking at the empty space he'd left behind. The room felt larger without his furniture, but somehow smaller too, like a deflated balloon. Dust particles danced in the last rays of sunlight streaming through the windows, and I could still smell the faint trace of his cologne, the expensive stuff Meredith had bought him last Christmas. I stepped inside and sat on the edge of the bed he'd slept in from age 7 until last week. The mattress dipped under my weight, springs creaking with familiar sounds that took me back to story time and sick days and Christmas mornings, when he'd bounce on this same mattress, too excited to stay under the covers. His baseball trophy still sat on the dresser, 3rd place in the City Little League Championships when he was 11. I'd taken a vacation day to watch that game, cheering from the bleachers while Susan kept score in her careful handwriting. Chris had gotten the game-winning hit, and afterward we'd gone for ice cream at Dairy Queen, where he'd insisted on ordering the largest sundae on the menu. "Dad, do you think I'll play in the major leagues someday?" he'd asked. chocolate sauce smeared across his chin. Maybe, I'd said, not wanting to crush his dreams with talk of statistics and reality, but even if you don't, you'll always be a champion to me. Susan had smiled at that, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. He gets his optimism from you, she'd whispered, but where had that optimism gone? When had Chris stopped believing in possibilities and started demanding guarantees? I stood and walked to the doorframe where we'd marked his height every birthday, black ink lines climbing the white paint like a growth chart for our hopes. 5 feet, 2 inches at 13, 5'8" at 16, 6 feet even at 18, when he'd finally surpassed my own modest height and teased me about looking down at his old man. Susan had been gone by then, cancer taking her when Chris was 14 and still figuring out how to be a teenager. I'd tried to be both parents, working double shifts at the electrical company to pay for the things I thought he needed. New clothes, a car for his 16th birthday, college tuition at the state university where he'd wanted to study business. Maybe that was my mistake. Maybe I'd confused providing for him with loving him, confused giving him things with giving him guidance. Susan had always been the disciplinarian, the one who set boundaries and enforced consequences. I'd been the soft touch, the parent who said yes when she would have said no. Love with boundaries, she used to say. That's how you raise a child who knows their worth without thinking they're worth more than everyone else. But after she died, the boundaries had seemed less important than his happiness. He'd been grieving too, and if buying him things or letting him stay out late or skipping chores made him smile, it had felt like a small victory in a house that had become too quiet, too sad. I found the old photo album in the bottom drawer of his dresser, one of the few things he'd left behind. Flipping through the pages, I watched our life in reverse. High school graduation, family vacations before Susan got sick, Christmas mornings with the tree surrounded by carefully wrapped presents. There was Chris at age 8, grinning with a missing front tooth, holding up a fish we'd caught at Lake Washington. Susan stood behind us both, her hands on our shoulders, looking more beautiful than any woman had a right to look in fishing clothes. "You spoil him," she'd said on the drive home that day, but she'd been smiling. "Someone has to," I'd replied. "Life will be hard enough when he's older." But I'd kept spoiling him even after life got hard, even after Susan wasn't there to balance my indulgence with her wisdom. Every time Chris had needed money for something, car repairs, spring break trips, the security deposit on his first apartment, I'd written the check. Every time he'd made a mistake, failing a class, getting a speeding ticket, losing a job, I'd fixed it. When had helping him become enabling him? When had love become the same thing as surrender? The answer came to me as I turned to a photo from 2 Christmases ago, the first time Chris had brought Meredith home. She sat on this same bed, perfectly dressed, even in casual clothes, smiling for the camera while something cold lurked behind her eyes. Even then I'd sensed something calculating about her, the way she'd noted the size of my house, the quality of the furniture, the neighborhood location. "Your father has excellent taste," she'd told Chris within my hearing, but it hadn't felt like a compliment. After that visit, Chris had started making comments about my big empty house and asking questions about my retirement plans. Casual observations that hadn't seemed casual at all. Meredith had been planting seeds, and I'd been too trusting to see them sprouting. I closed the photo album and looked around the empty room one more time. This had been Chris's sanctuary, his safe place, the room where I'd read him bedtime stories and helped him with homework and bandaged scraped knees. But it was also the room where he'd learned that wanting something was the same as deserving it, where he'd discovered that emotional manipulation worked better than honest conversation. Maybe this emptiness was fitting. Maybe it was time for this room to be empty, for Chris to find his own way without the safety net of my unconditional support. I picked up the Father's Day card I'd found wedged behind the dresser, construction paper and crayon, from when he was maybe 7 years old. In his careful printing, it read, "To the best dad ever. Thank you for always being there. Love, Chris." Always being there. That's what I'd thought love meant. But maybe being there for someone meant something different than always saying yes to them. Maybe it meant being willing to say no when yes would hurt them. I placed the card in the photo album and closed it carefully. As I stood to leave the room, my phone buzzed with a text message. I pulled it out, expecting another angry message from Chris, but instead saw my brother Tom's name on the screen. Heard Chris shouting when I drove by. "You okay?" I typed back quickly. "Fine." Actually better than fine. But as I hit send, I realized that for the first time in weeks, those words were actually true. My phone rang within minutes of sending that text to Tom. His voice carried genuine concern when I answered. "Gary, what the hell is going on over there?" I could hear Chris yelling from 3 houses down. I walked to the kitchen and poured myself cold coffee. "He's upset about me pulling the wedding money." "Good. About time you stood up for yourself. You want to talk about it?" So I told him everything, working backward through 2 years of increasingly bold manipulations that I'd somehow convinced myself were normal family interactions. "It started small," I said, "about 2 years ago, right after he met Meredith. Grocery money. Just this once, Dad. $20 became 40, then 60. By month's end, I was paying for his food while he took Meredith to expensive restaurants." Tom made a disgusted sound. "You didn't see the pattern. The language changed. Instead of, 'Can you help me out?' it became, 'I really need your support, Dad.' Instead of asking for money, he talked about family obligations and what Mom would have wanted." I told Tom about the car repair incident, $800 for transmission work that turned into a casino weekend with Meredith. About the engagement ring I'd funded because Chris had spent his savings on a truck. About Christmas dinner where Meredith had criticized every room in my house, while Chris nodded along. "She was shopping for your house," Tom said, "and I was too polite to see it." After dinner, Chris told me how perfect the house would be for raising children, how grateful they'd both be if I'd consider letting them move in. I pressed my forehead against the window. 2 weeks later, the nursing home brochure showed up. Tom was quiet for a long moment. "Gary, this wasn't love. This was a con game." "Other people saw it too," he continued. "Last family reunion, Aunt Martha said Chris had changed, that she was worried about how he talked to you." After we hung up, I sat at my computer and researched the Hilton Garden Inn wedding packages. Premium catering, bar service, music. The costs added up fast. Even with my $15,000, Chris and Meredith would face significant debt. But their cancellation policy was brutal. 75% of costs if canceled within 60 days. They were locked in financially. Then I found something interesting, a Business Journal article about Stone Medical Equipment's expansion plans, mentioning significant family commitments. The Stone family was investing heavily in their future. I picked up my phone and called Mrs. Patterson. Her daughter worked catering at the Hilton. Time to gather some intelligence. Mrs. Patterson answered immediately. "Gary, honey, everything all right?" Getting better by the minute. "Actually, I wanted to ask about your daughter Sandra. Doesn't she work at the Hilton Garden Inn?" 20 minutes later, Mrs. Patterson called back with information that changed everything. "Gary, the Stone family upgraded everything yesterday. Premium catering, extended bar service, jazz quartet instead of a DJ. Sandra estimates they added $12,000. The total wedding is now $35,000. $35,000? The Stone family had erased my financial leverage completely. There's more. No security beyond hotel staff, cocktail-style reception with no assigned seating. The venue staff wasn't told about guest restrictions. Anyone appropriately dressed is welcome. After we hung up, I stared at Susan's calendar on the wall, permanently frozen at December 2010. What would Susan do? She wouldn't sit home feeling sorry for herself. She'd show up to support her son, but she wouldn't let bad behavior go unchallenged. I walked upstairs and opened my closet where the wedding suit hung in its dry cleaning bag. $400 of wool and hope, purchased for a celebration I'd been legally disinvited from attending. But legal invitations weren't the only kind that mattered. I laid the suit out carefully, charcoal gray with pinstripes, conservative but elegant. The crisp white shirt, deep blue tie that Susan would have said brought out my eyes. In my dresser drawer, wrapped in tissue paper, sat the cufflinks Susan had given me for our 20th anniversary. I tried on the complete outfit, standing before the full-length mirror. The suit fit perfectly. In the reflection, I practiced extending my hand. "Congratulations on your beautiful wedding. I'm Gary Collins, father of the groom." The words felt both natural and revolutionary. On my dresser sat a wrapped gift, a leather-bound photo album filled with pictures of Chris throughout his life. Pictures with Susan, birthdays, graduations, family holidays. The final photo, Chris at age 10 in my workshop, wearing my oversized hard hat, grinning while I taught him to wire a light switch. I'd written a note. For Chris and Meredith, a reminder of where love begins and how it should grow. May your marriage be built on stronger foundations than manipulation and threats. With hope for your future, Dad. I made a dinner reservation downtown for 8 o'clock Saturday night, after the reception would wind down, when I'd need quiet space to process whatever happened. This wasn't just about the wedding. This was about reclaiming my dignity, my voice, my right to be treated with respect by the son I'd raised. I hung the suit back in its protective bag and set my alarm for Saturday morning. Wedding at 4, cocktail hour at 5. I'd arrive during cocktails when attention would be divided, when one more well-dressed guest would blend in until I chose to make myself known. Standing before my mirror one last time, I straightened an imaginary tie and smiled. For the first time in weeks, the man looking back at me looked like someone I recognized, someone who didn't apologize for taking up space in the world. Saturday couldn't come fast enough. The doorbell rang at exactly 7 o'clock Thursday evening, cutting through the quiet of my house like a blade. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the insistent double ring suggested urgency. Through the peephole, I saw 2 figures on my porch, Chris and Meredith standing together like a united front. I opened the door to find Meredith in a cream-colored designer coat that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage, her blonde hair perfectly styled, despite the spring evening wind. Chris stood slightly behind her, fidgeting with his car keys, looking like a man who'd rather be anywhere else. "Mr. Collins," Meredith began, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, "perhaps we can work this out like adults." "I wasn't aware children got married, Meredith," I replied, stepping aside to let them in. "But please, come in." She stepped into my living room with the careful movements of someone trying not to touch anything contaminating. Her eyes swept over my furniture, the recliner where I'd been reading, the coffee table Susan had picked out 20 years ago, the family photos on the mantel, with barely concealed disdain. Chris cleared his throat. "Dad, we came to talk. About Saturday." "I figured that much." I remained standing while they both perched on the edge of my couch like birds ready to take flight. "What exactly did you want to discuss?" Meredith leaned forward, her smile practiced and cold. "We understand you're upset about the misunderstanding regarding the wedding invitation." "Misunderstanding?" I repeated. "Your lawyers sent me a formal letter, rescinding my invitation. That seemed fairly clear." Chris shifted uncomfortably. "Look, Dad, maybe we overreacted. Maybe we can find a way for you to attend after all." "How generous of you." "All we're asking," Meredith continued, regaining control of the conversation, "is for a simple apology for the disruption you've caused, and perhaps a contribution toward the expenses as originally planned. Then we can put this whole unfortunate incident behind us." I looked at my son, searching for any sign of the boy who'd once built model airplanes with me in the garage, who'd cried in my arms when his pet goldfish died. But that boy was gone, replaced by this stranger who let his fiancée negotiate his relationship with his father. "Dad," Chris said, his voice taking on that wheedling tone I remembered from his teenage years, "Mom would want us to be together at my wedding. She'd want us to be a family." "Your mother would want you to treat your father with respect," I said quietly. "She would never have tolerated the way you've behaved these past few weeks." Meredith's mask slipped slightly. "Mr. Collins, you're being unreasonable. Chris has been very patient with your difficulty in accepting change." "My difficulty?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "My difficulty is watching my son turn into someone I don't recognize." "Dad, please." Chris leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "Other people are asking questions. Uncle Tom keeps calling. Aunt Martha wants to know why you're not involved in the wedding planning. It's getting complicated." So that was it. The social pressure was making them uncomfortable. Family members were questioning the narrative they'd created, wondering why the father of the groom was mysteriously absent from his son's wedding celebration. "Complicated how?" I asked. Chris exchanged a glance with Meredith before answering. People want to know why you're not giving a father of the groom speech, why you haven't been to any of the pre-wedding dinners, why your name isn't on the wedding programs. And what have you been telling them? That you've been under the weather, Meredith said smoothly, that you're having some health issues. Health issues. They'd been telling our family and friends that I was sick, creating a story that made me the problem, while preserving their image as caring young people dealing with a difficult situation. This is your last chance, Meredith said, dropping the pretense of sweetness. Either you apologize and contribute the money you promised, or you remain permanently excluded from your son's life. That includes any future grandchildren. I stood up slowly, feeling something settle into place inside me, a calmness I hadn't experienced since this whole nightmare began. Oh, I plan to be very much a part of Saturday. The certainty in my voice seemed to surprise them both. Chris's eyes narrowed. What's that supposed to mean? It means exactly what I said. I walked to the front door and opened it. I think we're done here. They stood reluctantly, Meredith's facade cracking further as she realized their negotiation had failed completely. At the door, she turned back with venom in her voice. You'll regret this, old man. You'll never see your grandchildren. I closed the door behind them and walked immediately to my bedroom, where I took the wrapped gift from my dresser and held it in my hands. Inside this elegant box lay something that would change everything on Saturday, something that would finally show Chris and Meredith the true cost of treating family like obstacles to be eliminated. Tomorrow was Friday, one more day to prepare for the moment when Gary Collins would remind everyone exactly what kind of man he really was. Saturday afternoon arrived with perfect April weather. Clear skies, gentle breeze, 72 degrees. I dressed with deliberate care. Charcoal suit, crisp white shirt, deep blue tie, Susan's sapphire cufflinks catching the light. The drive to the Hilton Garden Inn took 12 minutes through familiar streets toward what might be the most important moment of my adult life. The cocktail reception was in full swing when I entered the garden ballroom. Round tables with ivory linens, white roses, jazz quartet by the windows. Elegant, expensive. Exactly what Meredith demanded. I spotted Tom immediately near the bar, scanning the crowd. Gary! His face lit up. I wasn't sure you'd come. Plans changed, I said simply. I couldn't miss this. Around us, relatives began noticing my presence. Aunt Martha waved, confused but relieved. Uncle Pete approached, struggling to understand why the father of the groom had been mysteriously absent. We were worried when we heard you were under the weather, Pete said. I'm feeling better than I have in weeks, I replied truthfully. That's when Meredith spotted me. Her champagne flute froze halfway to her lips, face cycling through surprise, horror, panic. She hurried toward the wedding party area. Within seconds, Chris appeared, face flushed red, as he spotted me and began pushing through guests with determined strides. I continued greeting people calmly while Chris approached, like a man preparing for battle. Dad, his voice was a tight whisper, you need to leave right now. You're not invited. I'm here to celebrate my son's wedding, I replied loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. Isn't that what fathers do? People turned to watch, sensing conflict. Meredith appeared at Chris's elbow, panic barely controlled. This is our day, she hissed. You're ruining it. The day is young, I said pleasantly. I haven't started celebrating yet. I'm calling security if you don't leave, Chris threatened. That would certainly make an impression on your guests, I observed, as family members watched our exchange openly. Stone family members murmured among themselves, confused by the drama. Wedding party members stood frozen, unsure how to handle a situation etiquette lessons never covered. What do you want? Chris asked, voice cracking. I want to give you your wedding gift, I said, holding up the wrap box. Isn't that what fathers do? Before they could respond, I walked toward the DJ booth, where a young man managed the music and microphone. Behind me, Chris and Meredith's urgent whispers followed my movement across the room. Excuse me, I'm the father of the groom, I told the DJ with a smile. Could I borrow the microphone? I'd like to say a few words. He nodded eagerly and handed me the microphone. I tapped it twice, sending feedback through the sound system that cut through conversations like a knife. Every head turned toward me. Chris and Meredith stood frozen near the bar, faces pale with dawning realization that they were about to lose control completely. The moment I'd been preparing for had finally arrived. "Good evening, everyone." My voice carried clearly through the ballroom, reaching every corner where wedding guests stood, with champagne glasses frozen halfway to their lips. For those who don't know me, I'm Gary Collins, Chris's father. A complete hush fell over the room. Servers stopped moving between tables. The jazz quartet lowered their instruments, and even the hotel staff in the back of the room paused their work. Every face turned toward me, expressions ranging from polite attention to growing confusion as people tried to understand why the father of the groom needed to introduce himself. I held up the wrapped gift in my free hand, letting everyone see it clearly. I had planned to give Chris this tonight, but circumstances have changed. From the corner of my eye, I could see Chris pushing through the crowd toward me, his face desperate. But Tom stepped into his path, placing a firm hand on his nephew's shoulder. Other family members formed a subtle barrier, sensing that something important was happening and determined to let it unfold. "Inside this box," I continued, my voice steady and clear, "are the keys to a beautiful 3-bedroom home on Elm Street. I purchased it last month as a wedding gift for my son and his bride, thinking it would be the perfect place for them to start their new life together." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Several older women pressed their hands to their hearts, clearly moved by what they assumed was an incredibly generous gesture. The Stone family members exchanged glances, probably calculating the value of such a gift and adjusting their opinion of the modest electrician they'd been told was Chris's father. "But 2 weeks ago," I said, pausing to let the anticipation build, "Chris gave me a very different kind of gift for my 62nd birthday. The room was so quiet, I could hear the ventilation system humming. Meredith stood motionless near the bar, her face pale as winter frost. He gave me a brochure for a nursing home," I said simply, along with a demand that I give him my house so he and Meredith could have somewhere appropriate to live. The change in the room was immediate and electric. Smiles faded from faces, replaced by shock and dismay. I heard Aunt Martha make a small sound of distress, saw Uncle Pete's jaw drop open. Tom nodded grimly, his hand still firmly planted on Chris's shoulder. "When I suggested we could all live together while they saved for their own place," I continued, "I was told that wouldn't work. When I asked for time to consider their request, I was given an ultimatum: move to the nursing home willingly, or have the house taken from me anyway." Stone family members were now staring at Meredith with expressions of horror and embarrassment. Her father, a distinguished man in his 60s, looked like he'd been physically struck. Then after Chris moved out of my house, I received a legal letter formally rescinding my invitation to this wedding. Apparently, my presence wasn't required at my own son's celebration. The sound that went through the crowd was part gasp, part collective intake of breath. Several people began crying openly, not tears of joy for the bride and groom, but tears of sorrow for a father who'd been treated so callously by his child. I looked directly at Chris, who had stopped trying to reach me and now stood frozen in the middle of the crowd, his face cycling through shame, anger, and panic. "My late wife Susan raised Chris to be a good man," I said, my voice carrying the weight of 15 years of grief and disappointment. "She would be heartbroken to see what he's become. She would be horrified to know that her son chose cruelty over compassion, manipulation over honesty." "Dad, please," Chris's voice cracked as he called out, but I continued speaking. "I realize that giving someone everything they demand isn't love. It's enabling. It's teaching them that other people exist to serve their wants, rather than to be respected as human beings with their own worth and dignity." I held up the house keys, letting them catch the ballroom lights. These keys were meant to be given with love, to celebrate the beginning of a marriage built on mutual respect and shared values. Instead, they'll go to someone who understands the difference between asking for help and demanding what isn't theirs. Meredith finally found her voice. This is completely inappropriate. This is our wedding day." "Yes, it is," I agreed, "and I hope you remember this day for the rest of your marriage. I hope you remember the moment when a father's love was met with legal threats and nursing home brochures." I set the microphone back on its stand with careful precision. The silence in the room was deafening. No clinking glasses, no murmured conversations, No rustle of fabric as people shifted in their seats. Just complete, absolute quiet as 200 people processed what they'd just heard. "I wish you both well," I said, my voice carrying clearly without amplification. "But I won't be funding or supporting a marriage built on manipulation and disrespect." I began walking toward the exit, the wrapped gift still in my hand. As I moved through the crowd, people parted to let me pass. Some reached out to touch my arm supportively. Tom, Aunt Martha, Uncle Pete, even some of Chris's friends who looked stricken by what they'd learned about their friend's character. Behind me, I could hear Meredith's desperate voice trying to restore normalcy. "Everyone, please, let's not let this unfortunate outburst ruin our celebration." But the damage was done. The carefully constructed facade of their perfect wedding had crumbled, replaced by the truth of what their relationship had cost. As I walked steadily toward the ballroom exit, I felt lighter with each step, as if I was shedding years of accumulated disappointment and replacing them with something far more valuable: self-respect. The door was only 20 feet away when I heard Chris's voice behind me, desperate and pleading. "Dad, wait!" I paused with my hand on the door handle, then turned to see Chris pushing through the silent crowd, tears streaking his face, expensive wedding attire wrinkled from desperate movement. "Dad, please don't leave like this," he called out, voice breaking. "We can work this out. I'm sorry, okay? I'm sorry. Just please stay and we'll fix everything." The entire room watched our final confrontation. Tom stood with tears in his eyes. Even the Stone family looked stricken, finally understanding their daughter's manipulation. I looked at my son and saw flashes of the boy he'd been, crawling into my bed during thunderstorms, making Father's Day cards with construction paper. "Chris," I said gently, "the time for apologies was before you decided to humiliate me, before you let Meredith convince you that your father was an obstacle. You can't just abandon your only son on his wedding day. I'm not abandoning you. You abandoned our relationship when you chose manipulation over honesty. What about Mom? She'd want us to stay together. Your mother would want you to treat people with respect, especially family. She would never have tolerated you giving me a nursing home brochure. I'll give you back the house. I'll do whatever you want. Some things can't be fixed with last-minute promises, son. Some choices have consequences." Meredith appeared. "Mr. Collins, let's discuss this privately." "There's nothing left to discuss, Meredith. You're destroying your son's happiness." "I'm trying to save his character," I replied, "though I may be 15 years too late." I turned to Chris one final time. "I love you, son. I will always love you. But I won't enable you anymore." I pushed open the door and walked into the lobby. In my car, I sat looking back at the hotel, feeling completely at peace for the first time in months. The drive home took me through familiar streets that looked different now, like I'd rejoined a world where people treated each other with respect. I pulled into my driveway and looked at my house, truly mine now. As I walked to my front door, my phone started ringing. Chris's name flashed on the screen. I looked at it for a long moment, then turned it off and slipped it into my pocket. I put my key in the lock and opened the door to my home, stepping into a future I'd chosen for myself. The phone stayed silent, and for the first time in years, the silence felt like peace. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.